The fluorescent lights of Jefferson High School's gymnasium buzzed with an almost mocking indifference as parents filed into the bleachers. It was the annual Parent-Teacher Association meeting, and the November air outside had turned bitter, driving everyone inside earlier than usual. The basketball hoops had been folded up against the walls, and rows of metal folding chairs faced a small wooden podium where Principal Margaret Chen was shuffling through her papers. Harold Whitmore sat in the back row, his worn tweed jacket blending into the shadows of the gymnasium's corner. At 62 years old, he had been teaching English literature at Jefferson High for 37 years. His grey hair was thinning, his glasses perpetually sliding down his nose, and his shoes, the same brown leather Oxfords he had worn for a decade, were scuffed beyond any hope of restoration. He watched the parents arrive, noting how they clustered in groups, their designer clothes and luxury car keys catching the harsh gymnasium lighting. These were the parents of Westbrook Heights, one of the wealthiest suburbs in the state. Their children drove better cars than most teachers, and their vacation homes cost more than Harold would earn in his entire career. "Is this seat taken?" A voice startled him, and Harold looked up to see Tom Bradley, the school's janitor, gesturing at the empty chair beside him. "Please, Tom, I could use the company." Tom settled in with a quiet grunt. He was a large man in his 50s, with calloused hands and kind eyes. "Big meeting tonight. Heard the Carmichael woman is on the warpath again." Harold sighed. Victoria Carmichael was the PTA president, a former corporate attorney who ran the organization like a hostile takeover. Her son Brandon was in Harold's advanced placement English class, and their relationship had been tense ever since Harold gave Brandon a B- on his college application essay. An essay that Harold was fairly certain had been written by a professional tutor. "She's always on the warpath," Harold murmured, "though I suspect tonight she has a specific target in mind." The gymnasium continued to fill. Harold recognized most of the faces, the Hendersons, whose daughter Maya was one of his brightest students, Dr. and Mrs. Patel, whose son Raj had discovered a love of poetry in Harold's class, the Kowalskis, still grieving after their older son's accident last spring. And then there were the others, the Carmichaels, the Worthingtons, the Blackwells, the families who treated teachers like service staff and report cards like performance reviews for their investments. Victoria Carmichael swept in at exactly 7 o'clock, her Chanel suit impeccable, her blonde hair styled in a severe bob that seemed designed to intimidate. Behind her trailed her husband, Richard, a hedge fund manager who rarely spoke, but whose checkbook spoke volumes. They took seats in the front row, directly facing the podium. Principal Chen cleared her throat and tapped the microphone. The feedback whine cut through the murmuring crowd. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's PTA meeting. I know we all have busy schedules, so I'll try to keep things moving along efficiently." Harold noticed Victoria Carmichael's lips tighten at the word efficiently. Whatever she had planned, she clearly didn't want it rushed. The meeting began with the usual agenda items: fundraising updates, the winter formal committee report, budget allocations for the spring sports season. Harold's attention drifted, as it often did during these meetings. He found himself thinking about the stack of essays waiting on his desk, personal narratives from his junior class, many of which had moved him deeply. These were the moments that made teaching worthwhile. Not the meetings, not the politics, not the endless bureaucracy, but the moments when a student's eyes lit up with understanding, when words on a page became a bridge between souls. "And now," Principal Chen was saying, "we'll open the floor for new business. Mrs. Carmichael, I believe you had something you wanted to discuss." Victoria rose with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. She walked to the podium, and Principal Chen stepped aside, though Harold noticed the principal's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Thank you, Margaret." Victoria's use of the principal's first name was deliberate, a subtle assertion of power. "I'll get right to the point. As many of you know, our children's education is our top priority. We've chosen to live in this community, to pay the taxes we pay, because we expect excellence in return. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Harold felt Tom shift uncomfortably beside him. And for the most part, Jefferson High delivers on that promise. Our test scores are among the highest in the state. Our college acceptance rates are exceptional. Our facilities are state-of-the-art. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd with theatrical concern. But there are weak links in our chain of excellence, areas where we are failing our children. Harold's stomach tightened. He knew what was coming. I'm speaking specifically about our advanced placement English program. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Parents began to whisper among themselves, and Harold saw several heads turn in his direction. He kept his expression neutral, his hands folded in his lap. My son Brandon is an exceptional student. He maintains a 4.2 GPA. He's captain of the debate team. He's been accepted early decision to Cornell. And yet, she pulled a paper from her leather portfolio. This is his most recent essay from Mr. Whitmore's class, a B-. She held the paper up as if it were evidence in a criminal trial. Brandon has never received a B in his life. I had this essay reviewed by 3 independent educational consultants, all of whom agreed it was A-quality work. So I have to ask, what is Mr. Whitmore's problem? A few nervous laughs scattered through the audience. Harold felt the heat rising to his face, but remained silent. I've spoken with other parents, Victoria continued, her voice gaining momentum, and I'm not alone in my concerns. Mr. Whitmore's grading is inconsistent, his teaching methods are outdated, and frankly, his presence in an advanced placement classroom is doing a disservice to our college-bound students. Richard Worthington stood up from the second row. He was a heavy-set man with a florid face and the confident bearing of old money. My daughter has said the same thing. Whitmore spends half the class period going off on tangents about books that aren't even on the curriculum. She's trying to study for the AP exam, not listen to lectures about obscure poets. Exactly, Victoria nodded approvingly. We're not paying for philosophy class, we're paying for results. Another parent chimed in. Harold recognized her as the mother of twins in his honors class. My boys say he doesn't even use the textbook properly. He makes them write in journals like they're in therapy or something. The laughter was louder this time, more confident. Harold could feel the tide turning against him, the pack mentality taking hold. Principal Chen raised her hand. I think we should give Mr. Whitmore an opportunity to respond to these concerns. All eyes turned to the back of the gymnasium. Harold slowly rose to his feet, his knees protesting with familiar aches. He walked down the center aisle, aware of the whispers, the pointed looks, the barely concealed smirks. When he reached the podium, Victoria Carmichael did not step aside. She remained planted there, forcing him to stand awkwardly at her shoulder. Well, Mr. Whitmore, she turned to face him, her expression one of polite condescension. What do you have to say for yourself? Harold looked out at the sea of faces, parents who had never set foot in his classroom, parents who measured their children's worth in grade point averages and acceptance letters. He opened his mouth to speak, but Victoria cut him off. Actually, before you begin, I think we should take a vote. All in favor of requesting Mr. Whitmore's reassignment to a non-AP position, please raise your hands. The hands shot up like a forest of accusation. Harold counted them instinctively. 17, 18, 19, more than half the room. And against? A smattering of hands rose more hesitantly. The Hendersons, the Patels, a few others, perhaps a dozen in total. Victoria smiled triumphantly. The motion passes. Principal Chen, I trust you'll take appropriate action. The applause was sparse but enthusiastic among Victoria's supporters. Harold stood frozen at the podium, feeling something he hadn't felt in decades of teaching, genuine humiliation. Not embarrassment, not frustration, but the deep, burning shame of being publicly diminished. Wait! The voice came from the back of the gymnasium, near the entrance. It was strong but strained, as if the speaker was exerting significant effort. Everyone turned to look. A man in a wheelchair was making his way down the aisle, pushed by a woman in a nurse's uniform. He was thin, almost gaunt, with wisps of grey hair combed carefully across his scalp. Despite his apparent frailty, his eyes burned with fierce intelligence. Principal Chen leaned into the microphone. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a closed meeting for parents and faculty." The man raised a trembling hand. "I am a parent, or rather I was. My name is Arthur Jennings." A murmur went through the crowd. Harold's breath caught in his throat. Arthur Jennings. He hadn't heard that name in 20 years. "I don't believe we know you," Victoria said coolly, "and the vote has already been taken. Then perhaps you should know me before you finalize your decision." Arthur gestured to his nurse, who helped him rise unsteadily to his feet. He gripped the back of the wheelchair for support. "I've traveled 1,800 miles to be here tonight. Flew in from Seattle this morning. I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, and I have perhaps 3 months left. So I hope you'll forgive me if I don't waste time on pleasantries." The gymnasium had gone utterly silent. Even Victoria Carmichael seemed momentarily at a loss. Arthur began to walk toward the podium, each step deliberate and painful. His nurse hovered close, ready to catch him if he fell. 22 years ago, my son Michael was a student at this school. He was a junior, 17 years old, angry, troubled, on the verge of being expelled. His mother and I were at our wits' end. We'd tried everything: therapy, medication, military school. Nothing worked. Michael was convinced that life was meaningless, that he was worthless, that the future held nothing but disappointment. He paused to catch his breath, his hand pressed against his chest. One day I got a call from the principal. Michael had been caught with a knife in his locker, not to hurt anyone else. He'd written a note. He was planning to hurt himself. The school wanted him gone, and frankly, I didn't know what to do. Harold closed his eyes. He remembered Michael Jennings. He remembered everything. "But one teacher refused to give up on my son." Arthur's voice cracked. "One teacher saw something in Michael that no one else could see. He didn't just teach him literature. He taught him that words could be a lifeline, that stories could give meaning to suffering, that even in the darkest moments there was something worth holding on to." He reached the front of the gymnasium and turned to face the crowd. His eyes found Harold's, and for a moment, 20 years collapsed into nothing. "That teacher was Harold Whitmore, and my son Michael is alive today because of him." The silence was absolute. Harold felt tears burning behind his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. Victoria Carmichael's expression had frozen somewhere between shock and irritation. "That's a touching story, Mr. Jennings, but I hardly think one anecdote from 20 years ago." "I'm not finished." Arthur's voice, though weak, carried an authority that silenced her. "Michael went on to graduate. He went to college, not Cornell, not Harvard, but a small liberal arts school where he discovered his passion for writing. Today, he's a published author. He runs a non-profit that provides creative writing programs for at-risk youth. He's married, has 2 children, and last month he told me that Mr. Whitmore's class was the reason he's still breathing." Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he opened it. "This is a letter my son wrote to Mr. Whitmore 15 years ago. He never sent it. He was too embarrassed, but he gave it to me last week when I told him I was coming here. He said, 'Dad, if there's one thing I want you to do before you die, it's to make sure that man knows what he meant to me.'" He began to read, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, I know you probably don't remember me. I was just another troubled kid who sat in the back of your class, daring you to care. But you did care. You gave me Hamlet when I was thinking about ending my own story. You showed me that even in tragedy there's meaning. You told me that my words mattered, even when I was using them to push everyone away. I never thanked you properly. I was too proud, too scared. But I need you to know, you saved my life, not metaphorically, literally. I had a plan, and you gave me a reason to abandon it. Every breath I've taken for the last 20 years, every word I've written, every person I've helped, it all traces back to you. You are the reason I exist. Thank you." Arthur folded the letter with trembling hands. The gymnasium was so quiet that Harold could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. "I didn't come here to defend Mr. Whitmore's grading policies," Arthur said softly. "I came here because I'm dying, and before I go, I wanted to say thank you, to let this community know what kind of man they have teaching their children, and to ask you a simple question. Is this really the teacher you want to remove from your school?" He looked directly at Victoria Carmichael. Her face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "My son isn't the only one. In the past 2 days, since I announced on social media that I was coming here, I've received over 300 messages from former students of Mr. Whitmore, 300 people whose lives were changed by this man. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists, social workers, parents. They couldn't all be here tonight, but they wanted me to tell you, you don't know what you have, and if you throw it away, you'll regret it for the rest of your lives." Arthur's legs gave out, and his nurse rushed forward to catch him. Harold moved instinctively, helping to guide him back into the wheelchair. For a moment, their hands touched, and Arthur gripped Harold's fingers with surprising strength. "Thank you," Arthur whispered. "Thank you for my son." Harold couldn't speak. The lump in his throat was too large, the emotion too overwhelming. He simply nodded, squeezing Arthur's hand in return. Principal Chen stepped back to the podium, her eyes glistening. I think perhaps we should table this discussion for another time. Mrs. Carmichael, if you'd like to reconsider your motion." Victoria Carmichael stood rigid, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Her husband was tugging at her sleeve, whispering urgently. "The motion is withdrawn," Victoria said stiffly, "but this conversation isn't over." She gathered her things and swept toward the exit, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the gymnasium floor. A few of her supporters followed, though not as many as before. Harold remained standing at the front of the room, unsure what to do or say. The Hendersons approached him first. Mrs. Henderson was openly crying, and her husband shook Harold's hand with both of his. "We've always known," Mrs. Henderson said. "Maya comes home every day talking about your class. She says you make her think about things that matter. Don't let those people get to you." Others followed. Parents he barely knew, parents he'd had conflicts with, parents he'd never spoken to in 37 years. One by one, they came to shake his hand, to offer words of support, to apologize for their silence. Tom the janitor appeared at his side. "Not bad for a Tuesday night, huh?" Harold let out a shaky laugh. "Not bad at all." The following days at Jefferson High were unlike anything Harold had experienced in his nearly 4 decades of teaching. The story of the PTA meeting had spread through the school with the speed and intensity of a wildfire. Students who had never spoken to him stopped him in the hallways to shake his hand. Teachers who had kept their distance for years suddenly wanted to have lunch with him. But it was the messages that affected him most deeply. They began arriving the morning after the meeting. Emails, Facebook messages, LinkedIn requests, even handwritten letters forwarded from the school's main office. They came from every corner of the country, from former students he hadn't thought about in years, from people whose faces he could barely remember, but whose words he would never forget. There was Jennifer Martinez, class of 1994, who was now a civil rights attorney in Chicago. "You taught me that words have power," she wrote, "that the stories we tell can change the world." There was David Okonkwo, class of 2002, a professor of African American literature at Howard University. "You introduced me to James Baldwin when I was a confused kid who didn't know where I belonged. You gave me a language for my experience." There was Amanda Sullivan, class of 2010, now a hospice nurse in Maine. "Your class was the only place I felt safe. I work with dying people now, and I help them tell their stories before they go. That's what you taught me, that everyone has a story worth telling." Harold read each message carefully, sometimes 2 or 3 times. He kept a folder on his desktop where he saved them all, returning to them late at night, when the loneliness of his small apartment felt particularly acute. He had never married. There had been a woman once, decades ago, Rebecca, a fellow teacher with kind eyes and a quick laugh. But she had wanted children, a house in the suburbs, a life that Harold couldn't quite picture for himself. They had parted as friends, and she had moved to California. But these messages, these unexpected gifts from students he had forgotten or never truly known, they filled a space in his heart that he hadn't realized was empty. They reminded him that his life had mattered, that his work had left traces in the world, that he was not as alone as he sometimes felt. The Friday after the meeting, Harold arrived at school to find a surprise waiting in his classroom. The desks had been rearranged, and in the center of the room stood a small table covered with cards, flowers, and what appeared to be a cake. His advanced placement students were gathered around, their faces bright with anticipation. Maya Henderson stepped forward, a nervous smile on her face. "Mr. Whitmore, we heard about what happened at the meeting, and we wanted you to know that we think you're the best teacher we've ever had." A lump formed in Harold's throat. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," said Raj Patel. "Just read the cards. We all wrote something." Harold picked up the first card. It was from Sarah Chen, the shy girl who wrote about her grandmother's immigration story. "Mr. Whitmore, you taught me that my family's history is important, that our stories matter even when no one is listening." Another card from Marcus Williams. "You never looked at me like I was a problem. You looked at me like I was a person. That's more than most people have ever done." And another from Brandon Carmichael, Victoria's son. "I know my mom was the one who started all this. I'm sorry. The truth is, you're the only teacher who's ever told me the truth about my writing. Everyone else just tells me what I want to hear." Harold looked up at his students, these young people who would go on to live lives he could barely imagine. "Thank you," he finally managed. "All of you. This means more to me than you can possibly know." The bell rang, signaling the start of first period, but no one moved. Finally, Maya spoke again. "We have a question for you, Mr. Whitmore. The story that Mr. Jennings told, about Michael, about the journal, about what you did for him. We want to hear your side." Harold hesitated. In 37 years of teaching, he had never spoken about Michael Jennings. The memory was too painful, too personal, too tangled with emotions he had never fully processed. But looking at the faces before him, he realized that this was exactly the kind of story they needed to hear. "Sit down," he said quietly. "I'll tell you." The students settled into their desks, and Harold leaned against the edge of his, just as he had done thousands of times before. "Michael Jennings was in my third period English class in the fall of 2003. He was 17, tall for his age, with this look in his eyes that I'd seen before, the look of someone who has decided that the world is fundamentally hostile, and the only way to survive is to be hostile back." He paused, gathering his thoughts. He sat in the back corner by the window, never spoke unless called upon. He was smart, brilliantly smart, but he used his intelligence like a weapon, cutting down anyone who tried to get close. The other teachers had given up on him. His grades were failing, his attendance was spotty, and there were rumors about his home life. His father traveled constantly for work. His mother was fragile. Michael was essentially raising himself, and he was doing a terrible job of it. Harold walked to the window, looking out at the November sky. One day, about 2 months into the school year, I assigned a journaling exercise. I did it every year, nothing fancy, just 10 minutes at the beginning of class where students could write whatever they wanted. No grades, no sharing required, just private space for their thoughts. Most students used it to complain about their homework or gossip about their friends. But Michael wrote poetry. Dark, angry, beautiful poetry that he probably never intended for anyone to see. Maya raised her hand hesitantly. "How did you see it then?" Harold smiled sadly. He left his journal on his desk one day. "I should have just put it in the lost and found, but something made me open it. Call it intuition, call it a teacher's instinct. I knew I needed to see what was inside." He turned back to face the class. "What I found terrified me. Not just the darkness of his writing, but the specificity. He wasn't just exploring abstract ideas of death and meaninglessness. He was making plans. He had picked a date. He had chosen a method. He had written goodbye letters. The classroom was utterly silent. I stayed up all night, reading and rereading his words, trying to figure out what to do. I knew I should report it. That was the protocol, the responsible thing. But I also knew that if I reported it, Michael would be hospitalized against his will, and that experience might confirm everything he believed about the world. So I made a different choice, a choice that could have cost me my career and might have cost Michael his life if I'd been wrong. Harold took a deep breath. I waited for him after school the next day. When he saw me holding his journal, his face went white. He tried to grab it from me, but I held firm, and I said something that I'd been thinking about all night. I said, Michael, I've read your poetry, and I need you to know something. You're not invisible. I see you. Your words see you. And what they show me is someone with more life inside him than he knows what to do with. That's not a curse. That's a gift. But gifts can be burdens when you carry them alone. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at me with those dark, suspicious eyes. But I kept talking. I told him about the first time I read Hamlet in high school, how I'd felt a recognition so profound that it frightened me. I told him about the darkest period of my own life, my mother's death, my father's alcoholism, the years I spent wondering if any of it was worth the struggle. And then I offered him a deal. I said, I'll make you a promise, Michael. For the next 3 months, you and I are going to meet twice a week after school. We're going to read together, write together, and talk about whatever you need to talk about. And if, at the end of those 3 months, you still want to leave this world, I won't stop you. But I'm asking you to give me those 3 months. Give yourself that chance. Raj leaned forward, and he agreed. Not immediately. He said I was crazy. He said I didn't understand. But I told him something that I think surprised us both. I told him that he was right. I probably didn't understand, but I wanted to. And that desire, that genuine curiosity about who he was and what he thought, that was the only thing I could offer. Not answers, not solutions, just attention, just presence, just the willingness to sit with him in the darkness and see what emerged. He came to my classroom the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and for the next 3 months we read together. We started with Hamlet, then we moved on to Camus, to Dostoevsky, to the poets of the Beat generation. We read everything that seemed relevant to his experience, works that didn't shy away from darkness, but didn't wallow in it either. And we talked, not about his plans. I never mentioned them directly after that first conversation, but about meaning and purpose and what it might mean to live a life that mattered, about art as a way of transforming pain into something beautiful. Sarah's eyes were glistening. What happened after the 3 months? Harold smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in days. On the last day, Michael came to my classroom with a gift. It was a journal, a new one, bound in leather, completely blank, and tucked inside was a note. All it said was, I'm going to fill this one with life. He didn't become a different person overnight. He still struggled. He had setbacks, dark periods, moments when I worried all over again. But he had tools now, tools for processing his emotions, for finding meaning in suffering, for connecting with others. He graduated a year later with a B average and a handful of college acceptances. I didn't hear from him again for 15 years. Until last week, when Arthur Jennings came to tell me that his son was alive because of what we did in this classroom. Marcus spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. Why didn't you tell anyone? All these years, why didn't you let people know what you'd done? Harold considered the question carefully. Because it wasn't about me. It was about Michael, about what he needed, not what I needed. Teaching isn't about accumulating accolades or building a reputation. It's about doing the right thing for the person in front of you, even when no one else will ever know. The bell rang for the end of first period, but nobody moved. Finally, Harold gestured toward the door. Go on, you'll be late for second period, and eat some of that cake before you go. It looks too good to waste. The students gathered their things slowly, reluctant to leave. As they filed out, several of them touched Harold's shoulder or murmured words of thanks. Brandon Carmichael lingered by the door. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes, Brandon?" The boy seemed to be struggling with something. Finally he spoke. "I'm sorry about my mom. She means well, but she doesn't understand. She thinks everything is a competition. But what you just told us, that's not about winning. That's about something more important." Harold nodded. "Your mother loves you, Brandon. She just shows it in ways that sometimes miss the mark. Don't hold it against her." Brandon nodded slowly and turned to leave. At the door, he paused again. "That essay she complained about, the one you gave me a B- on, she was right that I didn't write it. My tutor did. I never admitted that to anyone before." Harold let out a surprised laugh. "I know, Brandon. Your writing has a distinctive voice. That essay had none of it. You didn't report me. Reporting you wouldn't have taught you anything. But watching you squirm for the last month, knowing that you knew that I knew, that I think has been educational." Brandon cracked a smile, the first genuine one Harold had ever seen from him. "You're sneaky, Mr. Whitmore. I prefer strategically patient. Now go to class." After Brandon left, Harold sat alone in his classroom, surrounded by the cards and flowers and half-eaten cake. He thought about the message he'd received that morning from Arthur Jennings, a short email, just a few lines. "Thank you for letting me share Michael's story. I fly home tomorrow and probably won't travel again, but I wanted you to know. My son called me last night crying. He said he finally understands why I came. He's writing again, really writing the way he did when he was 17. He says it's the first time in years he's felt the old fire. You gave my son his voice back twice. Once 20 years ago and once this week." Harold saved the email to his folder and closed his laptop. Through the window, the November sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the empty desks. In a few minutes, his next class would arrive, a group of freshmen, awkward and eager and terrified of high school. They would need him to be present, to be attentive, to be the teacher he had always tried to be. He stood up, straightened his worn tweed jacket, and prepared to do the only work that had ever truly mattered to him. The weeks following the PTA meeting brought changes that Harold could never have anticipated. What had begun as a local controversy had somehow transformed into something much larger. A student had recorded Arthur Jennings's speech on their phone and posted it to social media, and the video had spread in ways that defied Harold's understanding of how the internet worked. Within a week, it had been viewed over 2 million times. News outlets began calling the school, requesting interviews with the teacher who saved a student's life. Harold declined them all, uncomfortable with the attention and concerned about violating Michael's privacy. But the story had taken on a life of its own. The messages continued to pour in, not just from former students now, but from teachers across the country who recognized something of their own struggles in Harold's story. They wrote about the isolation of the profession, the constant criticism, the sense that no one understood what they actually did. They wrote about students they had fought for, battles they had lost, victories that went unrecognized. Harold read every message, but he couldn't respond to them all. There weren't enough hours in the day, and he was still teaching, still grading, still meeting with students who needed him. It was Principal Chen who finally intervened. She called him into her office one Friday afternoon. "Harold, you look exhausted." "I'm fine, Margaret, just a lot going on." "Sit down." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I've been watching you run yourself ragged for weeks now. You're taking on too much." Harold sank into the chair. "I don't know how to say no. These people are reaching out because they need something, and You can't save everyone, Harold. That's not arrogance talking, it's reality. You're one person, you have limits." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "The school board has approved a special recognition ceremony for you next month. Nothing too elaborate. Just a chance for the community to acknowledge what you've given us. And I've also arranged for a substitute to cover your classes the week before winter break. You're going to take a vacation. A vacation? I haven't taken a vacation in 12 years, I checked. Harold laughed despite himself. Has it been that long? It has, and it's not healthy. I don't care where you go or what you do, sleep, read, stare at a wall, but you're getting out of this building for a week, non-negotiable. The week before winter break arrived, and true to her word, Principal Chen had arranged for a substitute to cover Harold's classes. He packed a small bag, a few books, a change of clothes, his laptop, and drove to a cabin in the mountains that he had rented on a whim. It was nothing fancy, just a one-room structure with a fireplace and a view of snow-covered pines. But it was quiet and remote and exactly what he needed. For the first 2 days, Harold did almost nothing. He slept late, took long walks in the crisp mountain air, and read novels that had been sitting on his shelf for years. On the 3rd day, he began to write. It started as a journal entry, just a few lines about the events of the past few weeks, but the words kept coming, one after another, as if something had been dammed up inside him for years and was finally breaking free. He wrote about his mother, about Rebecca, about Michael Jennings. He wrote about the loneliness of his profession and the unexpected gifts that had come from it. He wrote about the meaning of teaching, the importance of connection, the terrifying vulnerability of caring deeply about people who might never know how much you cared. By the end of the week, he had filled 200 pages. When he returned to Jefferson High for the recognition ceremony, he was a different man, not transformed exactly, still the same Harold Whitmore in the worn tweed jacket and scuffed brown shoes, but lighter somehow, as if he had set down a burden he hadn't even known he was carrying. The ceremony was held in the same gymnasium where the PTA meeting had taken place, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. The bleachers were full. Not just parents, but students, teachers, alumni. Arthur Jennings had flown in from Seattle, accompanied by a tall, dark-haired man in his late 30s who could only be Michael. Principal Chen gave the opening remarks, speaking about Harold's decades of service and the impact he had made on countless lives. Then she invited former students to share their memories, and one by one they came to the microphone. Jennifer Martinez spoke about how Harold had taught her to use words as weapons for justice. David Okonkwo read a passage from James Baldwin and talked about the day Harold had introduced him to the author who would change his life. But it was Michael Jennings who received the longest ovation. He walked to the podium slowly, nervously, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Harold in the front row. For a long moment the two men simply looked at each other, acknowledging a connection that words could not fully capture. "I've been thinking about what to say all week," Michael began, his voice steady but emotional. "How do you thank someone for your life? How do you express gratitude for something so fundamental that you can barely even remember not having it?" He gripped the podium with both hands. "I was 17 when I met Mr. Whitmore. I was angry and scared and convinced that the world was meaningless. I had decided that I was going to end my story before it really began. And then this teacher, this ordinary, unassuming man in a tweed jacket, decided to pay attention. Not to lecture me, not to fix me, not to save me in some dramatic way. He just paid attention. He read my words. He took them seriously. He treated me like my thoughts mattered. Like I mattered, at a time when I was certain that neither of those things was true." Michael paused, his eyes glistening. What Mr. Whitmore did for me wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural. It was the most human thing in the world. He saw me. He really saw me. And that simple act of recognition gave me permission to see myself. He turned directly to Harold. "Mr. Whitmore, I never sent you that letter because I was afraid that if I acknowledged how much you meant to me, I would have to acknowledge how close I had come to losing everything. But I'm not afraid anymore. So I want to say what I should have said 20 years ago. Thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for showing me that words can be a lifeline, and that even the darkest stories can have hopeful endings. The applause that followed was deafening. Harold rose from his seat, his vision blurred with tears, and made his way to the podium. Michael stepped down to meet him, and the two men embraced, a long, wordless embrace that said everything that needed to be said. When Harold finally stepped up to the microphone, the gymnasium fell silent. "I don't have a speech prepared," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've spent my whole life giving speeches, lectures really, but tonight I don't have any words that feel adequate." He looked out at the faces before him, former students, current students, colleagues, strangers who had become friends. "When I started teaching 37 years ago, I thought I knew what the job was. I thought it was about transmitting knowledge, about helping young people pass tests and get into colleges. And those things are important, don't get me wrong. But somewhere along the way, I realized that teaching is about something much more fundamental." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Teaching is about recognition. It's about looking at a young person and saying, 'I see you, your thoughts matter, your struggles matter, your story matters.' It's about creating a space where people can become more fully themselves, where they can discover capacities they didn't know they had. I've been teaching for 37 years and I'm tired. I won't pretend otherwise. But tonight, surrounded by all of you, I'm reminded of why I've kept going. It's because of Michael and Jennifer and David and all the students I've been privileged to teach. It's because sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the seeds we plant actually grow. And there's nothing more meaningful than watching a human being become who they're meant to be." Harold looked at Michael, who was sitting in the front row with tears streaming down his face. "Michael, you thanked me for seeing you. But I need you to know something. You saw me too. You saw past the teacher to the person underneath. And that recognition, that willingness to trust me with your darkness, that was a gift I've carried with me for 20 years. He turned back to the crowd. "I'm not retiring yet. I've got a few more years left in me, God willing. But when I do finally hang up my tweed jacket, I'll do so knowing that my life has mattered, not because of any recognition or ceremony, but because of the connections I've made, the stories I've been part of, the lives that have touched mine. So thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for reminding me why I do what I do. And thank you for teaching me that the most important things in life can never be measured by a grade or a test score. They can only be felt in the quiet moments between one person and another, when we truly see each other for who we are." The applause that followed was not the polite applause of obligation, but something deeper, a sustained ovation that seemed to rise from the collective heart of everyone present. After the ceremony, Harold found himself surrounded by well-wishers. He shook hands, accepted embraces, posed for photographs with former students. Victoria Carmichael was notably absent, but her son Brandon was there, standing awkwardly at the edge of the crowd. When the crowd finally thinned, Brandon approached. "Mr. Whitmore, I wanted to apologize again for my mom, for everything that happened." Harold held up his hand. "Brandon, we've already been through this. You have nothing to apologize for." "I know, but—" The boy hesitated. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how teaching is about recognition, about seeing people for who they really are. And I realize that my mom, she doesn't see me. She sees this image of who she wants me to be, the perfect son, the Ivy League graduate, the future CEO, but that's not who I am." "Who are you then?" Brandon smiled ruefully. "I have no idea, but for the first time in my life I'm actually curious to find out, and I think that's because of you." Harold placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "That's the most important thing you could ever discover, Brandon. Who you are. Not who your parents want you to be, not who society expects you to be, but who you really are. Will you help me, just as a teacher, someone who sees me and tells me the truth?" "I would be honored." They shook hands, not the formal handshake of teacher and student, but something more genuine, an agreement between two people who had chosen to see each other. Spring came early that year to Jefferson High. The cherry blossoms bloomed in mid-March, carpeting the walkways with pink petals that students kicked through on their way to class. Harold watched them from his classroom window, these young people who were just beginning their journeys, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. The months since the recognition ceremony had been the most fulfilling of his career. He had been invited to speak at education conferences, to contribute to journals about teaching philosophy. He had declined most of the invitations. He was still a teacher, after all, and his students came first. But he had accepted a few carefully chosen opportunities to share what he had learned. The most meaningful development, however, was the program he had started with Michael Jennings. Together, they had created a mentorship initiative that paired struggling students with former students who had overcome similar challenges. The program was small, just a dozen students in its first year, but the results were encouraging. "We're thinking about expanding next year," Michael told him during one of their weekly phone calls, "maybe partnering with other schools in the district." "Don't expand too fast," Harold cautioned. "The program works because it's personal. Lose that and you lose everything." "I know. I learned that from you." One afternoon in early April, Harold received an unexpected visitor. He was grading essays at his desk when there was a knock at his door. "Come in." The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that seemed somehow familiar. She was dressed simply in jeans and a cardigan, and she carried a small wrapped package. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not sure if you remember me. My name is Rebecca Chen. I was a student of yours in 1989. The name triggered a flood of memories. Rebecca Chen, a shy girl with a gift for poetry, one of the first students Harold had really connected with in his early years of teaching. "Rebecca, of course I remember you. Please sit down." She took the chair beside his desk. "I've been meaning to contact you for years," she said, "but I could never find the right words. And then I saw the video from the PTA meeting, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. It reached me at exactly the right moment." Rebecca's eyes glistened. "I've been going through a difficult time. My marriage ended last year, my children are grown, and I've been feeling lost, like I don't know who I am anymore." Harold nodded, listening. "But when I watched that video, something shifted. I remembered being in your classroom all those years ago. I remembered the way you made me feel like my words mattered. And I realized that I had lost touch with that part of myself, the part that loved language, that found meaning in stories." She paused, gathering her courage. "I've started writing again, for the first time in 30 years. Poetry mostly. It's not very good. I'm rusty, but it's something. And I wanted to thank you for that, for planting a seed all those years ago that's finally starting to grow." She handed him the wrapped package. Inside was a slim volume of poetry, self-published and beautifully bound. "These are my first attempts. I wanted you to have them as a thank you, and also as proof that it's never too late, that the seeds you plant can take decades to bloom, but they're still alive, waiting for the right conditions." Harold held the book in his hands, feeling its weight. "Rebecca, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just know that you made a difference, that your work mattered, that even when you couldn't see the results, things were growing in the dark." After she left, Harold sat alone in his classroom, holding Rebecca's book. He opened it to the first poem and began to read. The verse was simple, but honest, the words of someone who was rediscovering her voice after years of silence. He thought about all the students he had taught, all the seeds he had planted, all the lives that were unfolding in ways he would never know, and he felt, for the first time in a long while, a deep sense of peace. This was the work, not the grades or the test scores, not the recognition or the accolades. The work was connection, human to human, soul to soul. The work was seeing people and being seen in return. The work was planting seeds and trusting that they would grow, even when the growing happened in the dark. The summer passed in a blur of quiet mornings and long evenings. Harold spent most of his time in his apartment, working on his own manuscript and preparing for the new school year. When school resumed in September, Harold returned to Jefferson High with renewed energy. His classroom had been repainted over the summer, a fresh coat of off-white that made the space feel somehow new. He arrived early on the first day, arranging desks and hanging photographs. Among the photographs was a new addition, a picture of Daniel Kowalski, a former student who had passed away the previous spring. Daniel had been a quiet student with a gift for writing, and he had gone on to complete a novel before his death. Harold had helped Daniel's family find a publisher for the book, and it was now being celebrated as a significant literary work. The first students began to arrive around 7:30. They were freshmen, mostly, nervous and uncertain, clutching their schedules like lifelines. Harold greeted each of them by name, having memorized the class roster the night before. By the time the bell rang, the room was full. 32 freshmen, looking up at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to boredom to outright fear. "Good morning," Harold said, settling into his familiar position at the front of the room. "My name is Mr. Whitmore, and for the next year, this is going to be our classroom. Not mine, not yours, ours. A place where we explore ideas together, where we wrestle with words and meanings, where we learn to see the world and ourselves more clearly." He paused, letting the words settle. "I'm going to ask a lot of you this year. I'm going to ask you to read books that are difficult, to write essays that challenge you, to participate in discussions that make you uncomfortable, and I'm going to ask you to trust me, to believe that everything I ask of you is in service of something larger than grades or test scores." A hand went up in the back row, a girl with bright red hair and a skeptical expression. "Yes? What's that something larger?" Harold smiled. "That, Miss Patterson, Emily Patterson. That, Miss Patterson, is what we're going to spend the year discovering. But I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with the photograph on that wall." He pointed to the picture of Daniel Kowalski. "That's Daniel. He was a student in this room about 15 years ago. He went on to become a writer, and last month his novel was recognized with a major award. Posthumously, Daniel died in an accident last year, at the age of 32. The room was silent. 32 faces stared at the photograph with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Daniel's story is not unusual. Many students who have passed through this classroom have gone on to do remarkable things, not because they were geniuses or prodigies, but because they learned to see themselves clearly. They discovered their voices. They recognized their own worth. Harold moved to his desk and picked up a stack of thin journals. "These are for you. Every day at the beginning of class, you'll spend 10 minutes writing in these journals, whatever you want, whatever is on your mind. No grades, no judgment, just space for your thoughts." He began handing out the journals, making eye contact with each student. "Some of you will resist this. Some of you will write nonsense. That's fine. But I promise you, if you give it a chance, if you use this time honestly, something will shift. You'll start to hear your own voice, and once you hear it, you can never unhear it." Emily Patterson raised her hand again. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes, Emily." "Did that guy Daniel, did he do the journal thing?" "He did, and the words he wrote in his journal became the seeds of the novel that won the award. His thoughts, his struggles, his questions, they all found their way onto the page. That's how it works. You start with chaos, and slowly, through the act of writing, patterns emerge, meaning emerges, life emerges." Emily nodded slowly, her skepticism giving way to curiosity. Harold looked out at his new students. He didn't know their stories yet, their hopes, their fears, their hidden struggles. But he would learn. Day by day, week by week, he would come to know them as individuals. "All right," he said, gesturing toward the journals. "Open to the first page. You have 10 minutes, write." The rustle of pages filled the room as students opened their notebooks. Some began writing immediately. Others stared at the blank page with confusion. Harold sat at his desk, watching them, knowing that the journey had begun. Outside the window, the September sun was shining. Another school year was underway. Another crop of seeds was being planted. The year unfolded in the rhythms that Harold knew so well. There were good days and bad days, breakthroughs and setbacks. He lost sleep over students who were struggling. He celebrated quietly when others found their footing. Emily Patterson, the skeptical red-haired girl from the first day, became one of his most engaged students. By the end of the first semester, she was writing poetry in her journal, raw, unpolished, but undeniably alive. "You have a voice, Emily," he told her one afternoon after class. "A real one. Not everyone does." She looked away, embarrassed. "It's just scribbling." "That's how it always starts. The question is whether you'll keep going. Will it matter, in the grand scheme of things?" Harold thought about Daniel and Michael and all the students who had asked him the same question over the years. "It will matter to you," he said, "and it might matter to someone else, someone you'll never meet, someone who'll read your words years from now and feel less alone. That's how it works. We write for ourselves, and somehow, mysteriously, our words find their way to the people who need them." Emily was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said, "I'll keep going." Months later, as the school year drew to a close, Harold stood once again in his empty classroom. The photographs were coming down, the desks were being stacked. Another cycle was complete. He thought about the students he had taught this year, Emily and 31 others. Some had flourished, some had struggled, most had fallen somewhere in between, but all of them had been changed, however subtly, by the time they had spent together. He had planted seeds, and now he was releasing them into the world. There was a knock at the door. He turned to see Michael Jennings standing in the hallway, a wide grin on his face. "Thought I'd stop by on my way to the airport, see the old classroom one more time." Harold smiled. "Come in. What are you doing in town?" "Book tour. Believe it or not, I finally finished my second novel. Took me 15 years, but it's done." "That's wonderful, Michael. What's it about?" Michael paused, considering. "It's about a teacher," he said. "A teacher who saves a student's life and never knows it. A teacher who plants seeds and trusts them to grow." Harold felt his eyes sting with tears. "Michael, I know, it's obvious. But sometimes the obvious stories are the ones that need to be told." They stood together in the empty classroom, two men connected by a bond that transcended time and circumstance. Outside, the summer sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desks. "Thank you," Michael said quietly, "for everything." "No," Harold replied. "Thank you for giving me a reason to keep going." Michael embraced him, and for a moment they were not teacher and student, not mentor and mentee, but simply two human beings who had recognized each other in the darkness and chosen to walk together toward the light. After Michael left, Harold sat alone in the gathering dusk. He thought about all the years behind him, 38 now, a lifetime of teaching, and he thought about the years ahead, however many remained, however they unfolded. He didn't know what the future held. He couldn't see the seeds that were growing in the dark, but he trusted that they were there, waiting for the right conditions, preparing to bloom in ways he could never imagine. That was the work, that was the faith, that was the love that made it all worthwhile. Harold Whitmore stood up, took one last look around the classroom, and walked out into the summer evening. Behind him, the room fell silent. But the words remained, they always did. And somewhere in a journal or a novel or a conversation yet to come, someone was finding their voice. Someone was discovering that their thoughts mattered, that their life had meaning, that they were worthy of recognition and care. The work continued. It always would. The following autumn brought with it the familiar rhythms of a new school year, but Harold approached it with a perspective that felt different somehow, clearer, more purposeful. The events of the past year had stripped away whatever cynicism had accumulated over 3 decades, leaving behind something pure and essential. He arrived at school earlier than usual on the first day, wanting time to prepare the classroom before the students arrived. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. He had spent the summer organizing, simplifying, letting go of old materials that no longer served any purpose. On his desk sat a small stack of letters, thank you notes from the previous year's students, which he had saved in a manila folder. He read through them occasionally when he needed reminding of why he did this work. Each letter was a testament to connection, a proof that his efforts had not been in vain. There was a knock at the door, and Harold looked up to see Principal Chen standing in the doorway with a cup of coffee in each hand. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing him one of the cups. "You know me too well, Margaret." She settled into the chair beside his desk, the same chair where countless students had sat over the years. "How are you feeling about this year?" Harold considered the question. "Good. Nervous, maybe, but good." "Nervous about what?" "The same thing I'm always nervous about, that I won't reach them, that I'll say the wrong thing, miss the signs I should see, fail someone who needs me." Margaret nodded slowly. "That fear never goes away, does it?" "No, but I've learned to see it differently. The fear isn't a weakness, it's a reminder that this work matters. The day I stop being nervous is the day I should retire." She smiled at that. "I have something for you, a gift from the district." She pulled an envelope from her jacket pocket and handed it to him. Inside was a letter from the superintendent, informing Harold that the school board had voted unanimously to name the English department's new creative writing center in his honor. The Harold Whitmore Center for Literary Arts would open in January, providing a dedicated space for students to explore writing, host readings, and work with visiting authors. Harold stared at the letter, momentarily speechless. "They wanted to do something to honor your contributions," Margaret explained. "Something lasting. I thought you should know before the official announcement." "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just keep doing what you've always done." After she left, Harold sat alone with the letter, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not the honor itself. He had never sought recognition, but the acknowledgement that his work had mattered to people beyond the walls of his classroom, that somehow, over 38 years, he had built something worth preserving. He thought about the students who would use the center in the years to come, students he would never meet, generations removed from his own teaching. They would sit in that space and write their stories, discover their voices, find the courage to express what was truest inside them. And they would do so because someone once had believed in the power of words to transform lives. That was legacy. That was meaning. That was the answer to the question he had been asking himself since he first stood in front of a classroom as a nervous young teacher with nothing but hope and a dog-eared copy of Hamlet. The first students began arriving shortly after 8. Harold watched them file in, the eager ones who took seats in the front, the hesitant ones who drifted toward the back, the defiant ones who tried to look as if they didn't care about anything at all. He saw himself in all of them in different ways. The curiosity of some, the fear of others, the desperate need to be seen that most of them tried so hard to hide. They were just beginning their journeys, these young people. They had no idea what lay ahead of them. The joys and heartbreaks, the failures and triumphs, the moments of connection that would sustain them through the darkest times. But Harold knew. He had been walking this path for 38 years, and he had learned something essential along the way. That life was not about arriving at some final destination, some ultimate achievement that would make everything worthwhile. Life was about the journey itself, the daily choices to show up, to pay attention, to recognize the humanity in others, and allow them to recognize the humanity in you. Teaching had taught him that. His students had taught him that. Every conversation, every essay, every moment of connection had been a lesson in what it meant to be alive. "Good morning," he said, settling into his familiar position at the front of the room. The students looked up at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to boredom to outright fear, the same expressions he had seen thousands of times before. But he saw them differently now, not as challenges to be overcome or problems to be solved, but as possibilities waiting to unfold. Each of them carried within them stories that no one else could tell, perspectives that no one else could share, voices that deserved to be heard. His job was simple, really. It had always been simple, though it had taken him 38 years to understand it fully. His job was to see them, to really see them, and to help them see themselves. "Let's begin," he said, and the room fell silent with expectation. Outside, the autumn leaves were beginning to turn. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would, and somewhere in that cycle, in the space between one generation and the next, between one story and the next, Harold Whitmore found his place. He picked up his worn copy of Hamlet and opened it to the first page. The words were so familiar now that he could have recited them from memory. But there was always something new to discover, some fresh insight waiting to emerge if only you were willing to look. "Who's there?" he read aloud, letting Shakespeare's words fill the room. The question echoed in the silence, as ancient and urgent as the human condition itself. "Who's there?" It was the question that mattered most, the question that every student was really asking, whether they knew it or not. Who am I? Do I matter? Is anyone listening? Harold had spent his life trying to answer that question, one student at a time, and now, standing in his classroom on the first day of his 39th year of teaching, he understood something he had always known, but never quite been able to articulate. The answer was yes. The answer was always yes. Every person mattered. Every voice deserved to be heard. Every story was worth telling. That was the truth that Harold Whitmore had dedicated his life to teaching, and that in the end was enough.